The marble lobby glistened like ice under the fluorescent lights, polished so perfectly that the ceiling banners reflected back in distorted shapes. A rush of footsteps echoed across the cavernous space, heels clicking, shoes dragging, voices murmuring, the ordinary rhythm of a weekday morning in one of the city's most powerful corporate towers. But the rhythm broke when a voice, sharp and scornful, sliced through the air. "Hey, you don't belong here. Step back." The words carried authority, but beneath them oozed something darker: contempt. The kind that wasn't about rules, but about who the rules were for. The man standing in the center of the lobby stopped mid-step. He wasn't in a suit like the others. He wasn't rushing with a phone pressed to his ear or a laptop bag slung over his shoulder. He wore a tailored coat, dark wool, and carried nothing but a leather folder under one arm. His name was Elijah Mercer. His eyes flicked upward to the 30-story banners unfurling from the mezzanine above. Bold white letters on navy blue fabric spelling out Mercer Innovations. His name, his company. And yet here he was being told he didn't belong. The voice came again, louder this time. "I said, step back. This isn't for you." The security guard stood with his legs apart, one hand resting on the baton clipped to his belt. His jaw was set, lips curled into a sneer. Behind him, employees slowed to watch. Some whispered. Others froze in awkward silence, glancing between Elijah and the guard as though watching a car accident unfold in slow motion. Elijah's fingers tightened on the folder. His breath came slow, steady, but his chest ached with the weight of history pressing down. This wasn't the first time a door had been slammed in his face. Not the first time someone had looked at the shade of his skin and decided it spoke louder than any name, title, or achievement ever could. But never before had it happened here. Not in the very building he had built, funded, and poured his life into. The guard stepped closer. "I don't care what excuse you're about to give me. You need to turn around and leave. This lobby isn't for trespassers." His hand brushed the baton again, a threat disguised as procedure. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Phones appeared in trembling hands. Someone muttered, "Do you know who that is?" But the words fell flat in the charged air. Elijah locked eyes with the guard, his silence louder than any protest could have been. His heart thudded with anger, but also with restraint. He could end this humiliation right now with one motion, a card, an ID, a word, but he didn't. Not yet. Because sometimes the truth needed to unfold slowly, painfully, in full view of the world. The lobby seemed to hold its breath. The polished marble reflected a tableau of power, ignorance, and history colliding in one fragile moment. And Elijah Mercer, billionaire founder of the company towering over the city skyline, stood frozen at the edge of that moment, letting the guards' arrogance pile higher and higher until it would all come crashing down. For a long moment, Elijah said nothing. He let the hum of whispers swirl around him, let the guard's voice echo too loud in the marble chamber. It was as if the building itself, the empire he had built brick by brick, was testing him. He could feel the weight of 100 eyes watching, waiting for him to defend himself. But instead, Elijah breathed in, shoulders squared, and turned his gaze toward the banner again. It was more than cloth and thread. It was a reminder of everything he had endured to see that name, Mercer Innovations, emblazoned across the skyline. Years ago, that name had meant nothing to anyone but him. Back then, Elijah was the boy with scuffed sneakers and a backpack heavy with borrowed textbooks. Raised in a neighborhood where cracked sidewalks stretched like scars and the only constant sound at night was the distant pop of sirens, he had learned early that dreams didn't come cheap. His mother, Lorraine, worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table, her hands raw from hours of cleaning offices not unlike the one he now owned. His father, a man whose laugh was once the loudest sound in their small home, had vanished before Elijah was old enough to tie his shoes. Elijah grew up with questions that never had answers and a hunger that never dulled. School was his battlefield, and knowledge became his weapon. Teachers dismissed him at first. Too quiet, too intense, too unwilling to accept mediocrity. But when grades came back, Elijah's name rose to the top. When competitions were held, he left with trophies clutched in trembling hands. He had been told more than once, "People like you don't make it to the top." And yet every insult, every slammed door, every smirk disguised as advice only stoked the fire inside him. By the time he turned 25, Elijah had an idea that would change the world of renewable energy. He pitched it to investors, rooms filled with men in pressed suits who smiled politely, but whose eyes betrayed doubt. More than once he was told his concept was too ambitious. Others weren't so polite. Maybe focus on something smaller, something more realistic. But Elijah refused to shrink. He mortgaged his future, emptied what little he had, and built a prototype in a cramped workshop that smelled of oil and rust. Nights blurred into dawns, failures piled high, but then a spark of success. A model that worked. Proof that he wasn't chasing a dream, but holding it in his hands. And when one bold investor finally listened, Mercer Innovations was born. Now, years later, Elijah stood inside the gleaming lobby of that dream made real. 30 stories of steel and glass rose above him, housing thousands of employees who relied on the company he created. Contracts with governments, partnerships with universities, awards from international councils, all bore his name. And yet, in the eyes of one security guard, none of that mattered. The guard stepped closer, his voice louder, feeding on the silence of the crowd. "Did you hear me? I said this isn't your place. Turn around before I have to remove you." Elijah's jaw tightened, but his eyes softened as he studied the man. The guard was young, maybe late 20s, his uniform too crisp, his stance too eager to show authority. Elijah wondered what kind of training had taught him suspicion before respect, judgment before patience. He wondered what kind of life hardened someone so quickly that they mistook arrogance for professionalism. Behind Elijah, a woman's voice broke the silence. "That's Elijah Mercer." The words rippled, hesitant at first, then firmer. Another voice added, "He owns this company." The guard scoffed, shaking his head. "Right, and I'm the mayor. Enough games. ID, now." Elijah didn't reach for his wallet. Instead, he let his silence linger, heavy and deliberate. A test of character, not for him, but for everyone else in the room. Who would step forward? Who would speak truth against arrogance? The woman who had spoken lowered her gaze. The man who had echoed her words shifted uncomfortably, retreating into the crowd. Phones were still raised, recording, but no one moved closer. The loneliness of the moment pressed against Elijah's chest. This too he knew too well. Standing alone against ignorance while the world looked on, silent witnesses to injustice. Still, he held his ground. The guard narrowed his eyes, hand now resting fully on the baton at his side. The air vibrated with tension, sharp as glass, waiting to shatter. And in that silence, Elijah's mind drifted. Not away from the confrontation, but deeper into it. He thought of his mother, who used to tell him, "The world will always test you twice. First to see if you'll break, and second to see if you'll rise." He thought of the young interns in this very building who looked up to him, kids who saw in his story proof that they too could rise. And he thought of what this moment meant, not just for him, but for every person who had ever been told they didn't belong in a place they had earned. The guard's voice cut through his thoughts. "Last chance. Leave, or I'll make you." A murmur rippled through the employees clustered near the elevators. Someone whispered, "This is going too far." Another voice, nervous and low, replied, "Why doesn't he just show ID?" Elijah heard it. He heard them all. And he understood the question, the doubt. But this wasn't about proving himself to one ignorant man. This was about something bigger, about showing that sometimes silence wasn't weakness, but power. That sometimes you had to let injustice expose itself fully before you revealed the truth. His eyes, calm and steady, locked on the guards. The moment was fragile, stretched like glass about to crack. Every second that passed pulled more people into its orbit, more witnesses into its weight. Phones still recorded, whispers still rose and fell, but the heart of the lobby was quiet, waiting, watching, bracing for the breaking point. And Elijah knew that breaking point was coming. The guard's hand hovered near his baton, a twitch of impatience in every muscle. "Did you hear me?" he barked, louder now, as though volume could substitute for truth. "This is private property. You don't belong here." The phrase hit Elijah like a stone thrown from an old, familiar hand. You don't belong here. He had heard it in classrooms, in boardrooms, on streets lined with glass towers and quiet malice. And every time, he had answered not with words, but with proof, with excellence that couldn't be denied. But tonight wasn't about proving. Tonight was about something greater. He remained silent, eyes locked on the guard, until the weight of his stillness unsettled even those watching. Whispers deepened. Phones tilted closer. The energy in the lobby grew taut, like a rope pulled between two forces, waiting to snap. Finally, the guard lunged forward, fingers brushing his baton. "All right, that's it. Stop." The word cut through the air like a blade, not from Elijah, but from across the lobby. A man in a tailored suit stepped forward, his voice steady but edged with unease. "That's Elijah Mercer." The crowd shifted. The man was not an employee, but a visiting client, his face familiar to some. His presence gave the words weight, but the guard only sneered. "You think I don't know when someone's bluffing? He doesn't look like an owner. He looks like trouble." A sharp gasp echoed through the lobby. The racism in the words wasn't hidden. It dripped, raw and unapologetic, staining the marble silence. Elijah felt the sting, but his face remained composed, carved from years of battles where emotion was both a weapon and a weakness. He knew the cameras were capturing every second. He knew this was no longer just about him and one guard. This was about everyone watching, in the building and beyond. The man in the suit stepped back, unsure, unwilling to risk more. The guard pressed closer. "Last warning. You walk out that door right now, or I put you out myself." A murmur rose in the crowd, urgent now. Some whispered about calling HR, others about alerting a manager. But no one moved fast enough. No one acted with the urgency Elijah deserved. The guard's hand gripped his baton fully, sliding it from his belt. The sound of metal scraping leather sliced the air, sharp and dangerous. And still, Elijah didn't move. His mind was steady, but inside, memories surged. Of the nights he and his mother were nearly evicted. Of the men in expensive suits who laughed him out of boardrooms. Of the doors slammed in his face when he dared to dream too big. He thought of the interns upstairs, perhaps watching this unfold on their phones, kids who believed in him because he had proven the impossible was possible. If he yielded now, what would it teach them? That silence wins? That prejudice is allowed to decide who belongs? No, not tonight. The guard swung the baton upward, not striking but brandishing, the threat alive in the arc of movement. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Phones caught the motion in shaky frames. "Sir!" a woman's voice cried near the elevators. "You're making a mistake!" The guard ignored her. His focus tunneled, all sharp lines and arrogance. Elijah, calm as stone, finally spoke. His voice was quiet, almost gentle, but it carried, cutting through the lobby's tension. "Tell me," he said, his eyes never leaving the guards. "What do you see when you look at me?" The question stunned the man. For a heartbeat he faltered, baton frozen mid-air. The crowd shifted, murmurs rising in confusion. "What?" the guard spat. "When you look at me," Elijah repeated, his voice steady, rich with an authority that didn't need shouting. "What do you see?" The guard's lip curled. "I see someone who doesn't belong. Someone who's wasting my time." Elijah nodded slowly, the faintest trace of sadness in his eyes. "Exactly. You see only what you've been taught to see. Not the truth, not the work, not the years that built the ground you stand on. Only what you want to believe." The guard bristled, anger overtaking hesitation. "You think words are going to save you? Show me ID or—" But Elijah didn't reach for his wallet. Instead, he stepped forward, one deliberate pace, closing the gap between them. The movement was subtle, but the effect was electric. The crowd gasped, the cameras zoomed closer, and the guard instinctively tightened his grip on the baton. Now they stood only feet apart, the air thick with anticipation. Elijah's voice lowered, intimate now, meant for both the guard and the hundreds watching. "You're so sure of what you see. But what if you're wrong? What if the person you've threatened, the one you've humiliated, is the very man whose name is carved into the stone outside this building?" The guard's jaw tightened. For a flicker of a second, doubt crossed his face. But pride is a heavy chain, and he clung to it. "That's not possible." The crowd stirred, whispers growing into a storm. Some employees looked at one another with panic. They knew the truth, but fear kept them silent. Others lifted their phones higher, sensing history in the making. And in that rising tide of tension, Elijah knew the breaking point was near. He thought of his mother's words again. "The world will test you twice, first to see if you'll break, and second to see if you'll rise." This was the second test. The guard raised the baton higher, preparing to force Elijah out, arrogance sharpening into violence. And at that exact moment, the hush before the storm, Elijah reached into his jacket pocket, slow, deliberate, his movements magnified by the dozens of cameras locked on him. The crowd held its breath. The guard tensed, ready to strike. And Elijah pulled out a small leather case. The leather case in Elijah's hand gleamed under the cold fluorescent lights. The crowd strained forward, phones trembling in sweaty palms. For a moment, even the guard froze, caught between anticipation and fear, baton raised like a hammer waiting for the nail. Elijah flicked the case open with practiced ease. Inside, the gold letters shone. Not a driver's license, not a visitor's pass, but an embossed executive ID, the kind only one man in this building carried. The name was unmistakable: Elijah Mercer, Chief Executive Officer. Gasps tore through the lobby, rippling like thunder across a still lake. Some covered their mouths, others whispered in disbelief, and the phones, dozens of them, zoomed in to capture the truth, as if to etch it into the digital record forever. Elijah held the ID up high, steady, letting the silence soak in before he spoke. His voice was calm, but beneath it lay an iron edge. "You said I don't belong here," he said, each word sharp enough to cut. "But this building belongs to me. Every floor above us, every light shining down, every salary paid from the vision I built, all of it exists because I refuse to believe the same lies you just threw at me." The guard's face drained of color. The baton wavered, then slowly lowered as realization spread like wildfire. His arrogance crumbled in the face of proof, leaving only shame, and the knowledge that hundreds of witnesses now watched his downfall unfold in real time. The silence fractured when someone shouted from the crowd, "That's the CEO!" Another voice chimed in, "He's the founder!" And then the murmur became a roar, the lobby alive with indignation and awe. Employees who had once stood frozen now surged forward, some in anger, others in support, their voices rising together in a wave of judgment against the man who had dared to belittle the very soul of the company. Elijah didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. Instead, he stepped closer, So near the guard could see the quiet fury in his eyes. "Look at me," Elijah commanded, "and understand this. You nearly assaulted the man who built the future you're supposed to protect. You didn't see my work. You didn't see my title. All you saw was the color of my skin, and you thought that gave you the right to decide my worth." The guard stumbled back, shaking his head as though denial could undo what had already been etched in digital memory. But the phones didn't stop recording. The crowd didn't stop watching. And Elijah didn't stop speaking. "You wanted to put me out?" Elijah said, his voice rising now, echoing off the marble walls. "No. Tonight, you walk out of here. Not me." For the first time, the guard's baton clattered against the floor, useless and abandoned. His lips parted, searching for an apology, but the words tangled, lost. He turned toward the exit, sweat beading on his forehead. And then it happened. The shift. The moment the story no longer belonged to just the people in that lobby. Someone live streaming shouted, "It's going viral!" Their screen already flooded with comments, hearts, and angry emojis. Within minutes, thousands were watching the guard's shame spiral out of control. The cameras followed as he staggered toward the glass doors, but Elijah's voice rang out once more, freezing him in place. "This isn't just about you," Elijah said, eyes sweeping across the lobby, across every lens pointed his way. "This is about every time someone has been told they don't belong. Every time power was abused. Every time silence protected injustice. Tonight, the silence ends." The lobby erupted, not in applause but in something deeper, a collective realization, a breaking of the spell that had kept so many complicit for so long. And the guard? He stood small, insignificant, his authority stripped bare. For the first time, he realized what true power looked like. Not a baton, not a badge, but a man unbroken, standing tall in the truth of his own worth. Elijah's gaze lingered on him one last time. Then, turning away, he walked calmly toward the elevators, the crowd parting like a tide around him. Every step he took was heavy with victory, with justice, with the weight of history shifting in real time. The cameras stayed fixed on him until the elevator doors closed, but by then, the story had already escaped the lobby, carried into the world, unstoppable. The climax was complete. The power had shifted. But silence is deceptive. Within hours, the story spread beyond the building, beyond the city. Video clips of the confrontation made their way online, sparking outrage, sparking conversations. News outlets picked it up. The image of a billionaire black CEO being profiled in his own company's lobby, sparking debates about racism, power, and the fragility of progress. Some would dismiss it as a misunderstanding. Others would use it as proof of a deeper sickness still rooted in society. For Elijah, it wasn't just about a guard with a baton and a bad attitude. It was about the interns who had watched, the employees who had whispered, the future leaders who would remember the sight of their CEO refusing to bow, refusing to let prejudice dictate his place. It was about resilience, about dignity, about the reminder that even when you own the building, the fight for belonging never really ends. As the elevator rose, Elijah leaned back, his reflection staring back at him from the mirrored wall. He thought of his mother, who had once told him, "They'll try to tell you where you don't belong. Your job is to remind them who you are." He closed his eyes, inhaled deeply, and smiled. Not because the battle was over, but because he knew he had won this round with nothing but truth. And the world would remember. Because in that marble lobby with the whole company watching, Elijah Cross had turned prejudice into a lesson, and left a man who thought he had power begging for mercy without ever raising his voice.